All right, I propose that we get started. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this event organized by the Illicit Trade Group with support of the Agricola School for Sustainable Development. This event is titled The Costs and Benefits of Sanctions on Russia. And we have tabled it an expert discussion. We've labeled it an expert discussion as a roundtable. More or less centering on the question, will higher energy costs be enough to solve the Ukrainian crisis, or perhaps also tackle this issue in a broader fashion? What are the costs and benefits of sanctions on Russia? We've gathered 6 experts on the topic that will deliver each a short speech, and after the first round of 3 speakers we will have a round of Q&A. And after the second round of speakers, we will again have a round of Q&A. All of that in order to give us as much time as possible to get some debate, get some discussion on this very topical issue. I have to announce beforehand that we will be recording this event, the presentations as well as the discussions, just so you know. Unfortunately, or perhaps rather fortunately, this morning no very serious new developments have been announced by President Putin. There is not an immediate declaration of war. Things are looking as if they are stalling a bit, but ongoing, and the situation remains tense and extremely serious. That's where we find ourselves today. And what we're going to discuss, what we would like to discuss in the broader topic of illicit trade is that question, will sanctions on Russia help? And we've organized this as the Illicit Trade Group. My name is Pim Geelhoed. I'm Associate Professor of Criminal Law and Criminal Procedure and one of the coordinators of the Illicit Trade Group at the University of Groningen, together with Francesco Giumelli, who will also be in the panel. We're very happy that we have the collaboration of eminent academics and specialists in this matter. And I will introduce first the speakers in the first round of 3 speakers and give them each a floor for 5 minutes just to give their view before we start on the first round of Q&A. So the first speaker of today is Dr. Victor Sepp, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Groningen examining Europe's external sanctions. So he also delivered a speech a while ago for us, and we're very happy that he's joining us again as a member as well of the Illicit Trade Group. And then the second speaker is Professor Dirk Bezemer, who is a professor of economics of international financial development, and we're very happy that he's joining us as well today. And thirdly, Helene Over de Linden, who is a PhD researcher at the University of Groningen, who is working on a PhD thesis about the 2014 EU sanctions against Russia, Eastern Ukraine and Crimea, so also very much into this topic. Without further ado, I'm giving the floor to Victor to present his views on the matter, and the floor is yours, Victor.
Thank you very much, Pim, and thanks once again for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here once again. So as a short introduction, I will talk about the size of the sanctions that have been imposed against Russia. So as many of you know, sanctions have been imposed against Russia since 2014, mainly because Russia first annexed the Crimean Peninsula and then destabilized eastern Ukraine. Back in 2014, there were 3 rounds of sanctions. Basically, the first 2 rounds of sanctions focused on mostly, but not exclusively, on travel bans and asset freezes. And in the third round of sanctions back in 2014, we could also witness the introduction of sectoral sanctions after the downing of a passenger aircraft, the MH17. So those sectoral sanctions included restrictions on Russians' access to the EU capital markets, arms embargoes, prohibition of dual-use goods, the export of dual-use goods, and so on and so forth. So back in 2014, EU member states were, careful in the sense that, for example, there was no real appetite for a ban on Russian oil or Russian gas. And there were also discussions back in 2014 whether to exclude some banks, Russian banks, from the SWIFT, but that didn't really happen. So if you want to compare the Russian sanctions regime to the Iranian sanctions regime, the Iranian sanctions regime, we usually say that this was a 10 out of 10 sanctions regime. Well, back in 2014, the Russian sanctions regime was something like 2 out of 10. So the big question, what happened between 2014 and 2022? Well, first of all, we could, of course, witness the emergence of horizontal sanctions regimes, including chemical weapons, cyber sanctions, human rights sanctions, and all of these sanctions regime now include Russian individuals and entities. Of course, 2022 is a major turning point because we could, on the one hand, we could see a very intense cooperation between the United States and the European Union. This cooperation is basically done through the G7, which used to be the G8 back in 2014, when Russia was basically kicked out of the G8. So G7 is an important forum for coordination. It was perhaps more the cooperation was more intense than ever. I'm not suggesting that there is a complete harmony between the United States and the European Union, but this was really an almost unprecedented intensity of cooperation between the two sides and also between like-minded states. On the other hand, what is perhaps more important is that sanctions went beyond most of our expectation, given that, for example, of course, I don't have really time to list all the sanctions that have been imposed against Russia since the last couple of weeks, but take the example of the targeting of Russian central bank, which is, quite unprecedented in the sense that central banks are rarely on sanctions lists. And if you look at the numbers, you could see that approximately Russia had $640 billion of foreign reserve. Well, half of them are now targeted by the United States, by the European Union, by the United Kingdom, and other like-minded states. So that obviously that had a great impact on Russia's financial system. On the other hand, we also talked about the fact that some of the Russian banks were excluded from the SWIFT, and the SWIFT is often considered as the nuclear option of sanctions. Well, it is not really the nuclear option of sanctions. However, it is true that excluding from the SWIFT also means that transactions become much more costly and less efficient. So if you're out of the SWIFT, then your life may become, of course, much more difficult in the financial system. Of course, Russia has tried to build its own alternatives, but the alternative Russian system is not very efficient and it's not very competitive, especially if you compare with the SWIFT. Final sentence, because I have only 5 minutes, is the fact that we are talking about nowadays, of course, about the sixth package of sanctions. That will probably include some kind of an oil sanction. What I have read in the Financial Times is that on Sunday EU ambassadors met in Brussels but couldn't make a compromise because seemingly Hungary is blocking that sanctions, so sanctions against the oil sector, but seemingly other member states, such as Bulgaria, also raised some concerns with regard to oil sanctions. So I'm really curious what will happen with the oil embargo, and I'm looking forward to the discussion and maybe to a Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor, for this concise overview. Excellent picture that you've painted. Let's go straight on to Dirk Bezemer. Dirk, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for putting together this excellent event. I will make a few remarks based on my expertise on the international financial system. And I think we should, to structure thinking about this, we should think about two issues. The first is the issue of denomination of money, which didn't seem too big of an issue before all this happened. Just money is money, and international payments are international payments. Of course, they happen in dollars or euros or pounds, but everything is exchangeable. Now, not everything is exchangeable anymore, and suddenly we can see the plumbing, the structure behind the international payment system, and we can see the hegemony of the dollar again. And the second issue I want to say something about is bigger questions that this raises about how the international economy is organized. So briefly, when we think about excluding Russia, what has happened to exclude Russia from using dollars, basically, from using dollar or euro denominated payments, the first way that's been done is the SWIFT payment system, of course. There are workarounds, but they are costly, as Victor already mentioned. The second way has been to capture bank accounts, the 640 or 630 billion dollars in foreign reserves that Russia had. So the first is to stop flows of money. And the second is to capture stocks of money. And the second has turned out to be much more harmful, especially, as Victor already said, because the central bank is involved, the central bank is targeted, and therefore, even this became clear only last week to most people by a paper of the Brussels think tank Bruegel, even the dollars that are paid in payment for gas and oil, they are paid in euros, but then they are frozen if nobody cooperates with the Russian central bank to put them in the hands of Russians to pay for imports. Okay, so it's really important that even if payments are made, they are still payments in euros that the Russians apparently cannot use. At the moment, there's still a little bit of unclarity about this. Okay, so denomination matters a lot. And I should add here that Russia has a current account deficit apart from gas and oil, so it needs to import manufacturers. So it's really important. This is something that really bites. Let me see. And the final method of financial sanctions is to capture non-financial wealth, such as yachts and so on. And to my mind, this is more symbolical, and I also would have some doubts about it, whether this is really something that we should do. But maybe we can discuss that more later. Let me see. Okay, so there's much more to say about this. Russia can still pledge, for instance, captured bank accounts as collateral to, for instance, China to import. So there's all kinds of leaks and works around, but by and large, these sanctions are very effective in undermining Russia's financial position. So the war chest that Russia had built up since 2014, very consciously apparently, quite suddenly turned out to be not available to them anymore, even though officially they were their property. So we are looking at the breach of contract, if you like. The second set of remarks, briefly, is about bigger questions, and I want to highlight three questions without saying too much about them given the time. The first is the question of dollar hegemony. There's now a lot of talk in all kinds of fora about is this strengthening the dollar as the world's reserve currency, or is it undermining it, right? So if you're the paradox is, if you're using the power of the dollar, you're stimulating other blocs, such as China and maybe Russia, to develop alternatives. So by using it, you might weaken it. Now, there isn't much sign of this yet, certainly not in Russia, which only has a very weak alternative system, as Victor already mentioned. I think the more interesting question is about about China, which has been working on a regional clearing and settlement, partly barter system, within Asia, and they and of course China might now experience a big stimulus to accelerate that. The second big question is: are we politicizing global public infrastructure? So SWIFT is based in Brussels, and the global banking system is basically based in London and New York, and Frankfurt and Paris to an extent, and Amsterdam. So there are some hubs, and they're under national jurisdictions, and we're now using this nationality, if you like, this location, to make the financial system take sides. And the question is, what are the longer term consequences of this? It means that everybody now knows that the global financial architecture, the global financial plumbing, is not automatically available to everybody, and it's become very clear, nakedly clear, that in the end the US and Europe decide who is using this system and who is not. So that brings in a political question to what previously used to be not a political question. I think very few people in January would have called SWIFT a political thing. And the third question is the question of deglobalization. So we know that globalization, measured in terms of imports plus exports, for instance, has already peaked. The question is, what is the consequences of all this for deglobalization? Is it just excluding one country, even though an important country in terms of energy and food? Is it just excluding one country from the global financial system, or is it going to accelerate deglobalization in other ways? For instance, Sberbank, the biggest Russian bank, used to be an international bank. Suddenly it's only a Russian bank because it can't operate internationally anymore. That's a very radical way of deglobalization. The question is this confined to Russia only, or will there be spillover effects? There's much more to say about each of these issues. I just put them on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Dirk. You did that. Definitely, we have some questions lying on the table right in front of our noses now. We'll return to that during the Q&A. So let's go over to the last speaker of this first panel, Helene over the Linden. Helene, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. Yes, the topic of my presentation is implementation challenges in the Netherlands, because we had some last week, so it's interesting to explain a little bit more about this topic. I assume that you are familiar with the most important applicable sanctions regulations, so the 269 and 833, because these regulations are implemented in 2014, and they are still applicable. They are just extended and changed a lot of times. So also the new sanction regulations are based on this old one of 2014. Very often that is the question, but it's the same. It are the same regulations. So I will briefly explain what are the implementation challenges now in the Netherlands. First of all, we had a freezing concept, so assets had to be frozen, but in the Netherlands, in civil law and administrative law, we even don't know the concept of freezing of assets. We only have now the freezing concept in the criminal law, and that's only since 2014, then became applicable the freezing and confiscation directive, and then all the member states had to implement the concept of freezing in the criminal law. And then we said, okay, we have already Article 94 of our criminal code. So in criminal law, we know the concept of freezing, but not in administrative and civil law. So then in 2014, our Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued the so-called regulation Territorial Integrity, Ukraine. And that's an important regulation because that gives the possibility to our different ministries to issue certain additional regulations in order to freeze. So in 2014, this regulation was very simple, only 4 articles, and they gave provisions to the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Foreign Trade to release funds if there is a question of a sanctioned person to release. But now recently we had a lot of scandals. It was on television several times about why we are not doing anything, because there are super yachts, there are possibly a lot of immovable property, and nothing is frozen in the Netherlands. So then it became clear that our ministry was a little bit slow and late to amend this sanction regulation territorial integrity. And that was the reason that, instances like our cadastre had no possibility to freeze immovable property. For them, there was just no additional regulation to do it. So then we decided to work more detailed on it, and to announce Stef Blok as the supervisor of the sanctions, the sanction coordinator. So now the regulation is more detailed, and we have a lot of extra possibilities in the Netherlands. Different ministries have now the possibility to act in order that assets will be frozen, and also that our customs have more possibilities to know what they have to check. So this has been ameliorated, but still we have some issues. And first of all is that all the structures of all the oligarchs, it's not just an oligarch like Alec Perro for Abramovich has just a super yacht registered in the Netherlands on his name. No, there are a lot of structures, a lot of entities between it. So therefore it's really very difficult to find who is the end user. So then we are facing with a lot of problems to understand which assets has to be frozen. So that's not only with the assets in the Netherlands, but it's also when there are products where is a ban on when they are exported or imported. It's also very difficult to see who is the end user, and if some products who are exported to Russia goes again to an oligarch or not. So we are facing really a lot of problems, and that's the reason that we until now only have frozen 600 million euros in the Netherlands, and other countries like Belgium or France, they have frozen already milliards of euros, and we have often different explanations for it, but I think the most important is that yes, Netherlands is the country of financing holding companies, so that's really difficult to find the end user. And then we have still another issue. What is now we are now facing too, because some weeks ago they invited me to the Dutch Parliament to explain what we can do with our frozen assets. So now we have frozen for 600,000 euros, but then it has to be confiscated. And we also the specialists in the CFSIP, they know that it's these regulations are just administrative, temporary, and reversible. So it's not possible now currently to say, okay, we have frozen assets and now we are going to confiscate them. So even in the Dutch Parliament, there were raised questions how to solve this issue, that we can start to confiscate what is frozen currently. But until now, there is no real solution for it. So they asked me to give some tools or to think with them together in order to solve this issue. So currently we are just preparing an answer on this interesting question. That's what currently I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Helene, for this update on the implementation of sanctions regulations in the Netherlands. Very important, of course, to have that as in order to ensure that things will be effective in the end. So thanks to all our panelists of the first panel, we have some room for Q&A because that's important. What we think that we get some debate going. There are major questions on the table, major issues, challenges. Let's see who wants to comment. I invite anyone just to raise your hand, either if you are on the panel and want to react, want to respond to other opinions of other panelists, or just the general public, all the rest. Let's join in for some discussion. Raise your hand. The button is in the side panel under the People tab down at the end of that panel. You can click Raise Hand, and then I hope that I will see that you did. I guess that there will be some questions or comments. Anyone? Yeah, that's a gebruiker. I don't know who that is. But please go ahead.
Yeah, I have raised my hand. Can I ask a question?
Kiriaki, yeah.
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to thank all the presenters for the fantastic update and overview of the situation. I have a quite general question. I think it mostly goes to Victor. Victor said that there is an unprecedented cooperation between the EU and the US in imposing sanctions against Russia, especially after 2014. And I wonder why that is. What is so different now compared to 2014? And we see this overlap in the actions regarding sanctions. And I also wonder whether this is in the benefit of one or the other side, in the benefit of the US or the EU, or none of them or both. Thank you.
Shall I go, Pim, or shall we collect questions?
I think we can. I don't see any other hands raised, so please go ahead. If others have questions, please raise your hand, and I will try to streamline everything.
Yeah, so thank you once again for the question. I think this is a very good question. So it's not easy to answer. So if you look back, we could, look back in the history, we could see, I think, two examples where there were very intense cooperation. One is the case of Iran, and the other case was the case of Russia back in 2014. The paradox situation was, back in the old days, was that those cases, in those cases, you could see a very intense cooperation, but at the same time, those cases caused the most frictions between the two sides, between the European Union and the United States. In the Iranian case, there were frictions because the United States imposed extraterritorial sanctions. Obviously, the European Union, was trying to defend its so-called strategic autonomy by, activating the blocking statute, and by coming up with a new blocking statute, which will be, I think, published in the coming weeks. The case of Russia back in 2014 also caused some frictions, given that the US was a little bit dissatisfied with the European Union's approach not to target some sectors that the US targeted. Now, in 2022, there were, I think, there was a major cooperation given the widespread belief that this is something unprecedented, what happened in Eastern Europe and in Europe in general. The fact that war came back to Europe is something that nobody wants to accept. So I think the reason why there is so much intensity in cooperation is the fact that this is something which is unaccepted by the European Union, unaccepted by the United States, and both of them want to achieve something now that could really have an impact on Russia. And I think this is one of the underlying reasons. And also, one final sentence is that both sides have prepared their measures for weeks. So they had a little bit of time to cooperate. So if you wonder why the European Union was quick and fast when it came to impose sanctions against Russia, well, the European Union was a little bit prepared. Because they have prepared the sanctions since early December 2021, and they imposed in February 2022. So they had some weeks and months to prepare those sanctions.
Thanks.
Yeah,
I see that Dirk wants to respond, and Tony after that. First, Dirk.
Yes, so I want to add to what Victor just said in terms of the financial side of the story. So we could compare this. The question was compared to earlier sanctions events, but we can, when you look at this, it's an example of international financial cooperation. Yeah, so it's joining financial forces to achieve a common foreign policy goal. Now, in the Corona crisis, Europe and the US have done exactly the same thing. And in the credit crisis in 2008, they've done exactly the same thing. Yeah, so the two financial hubs of the world are Europe and the United States. And they've immediately joined forces by extending dollar swap lines and so on, both in the credit crisis and when European banks were actually hit very hard. And in the Corona crisis, when both European and the US governments, and of course other governments, but they particularly had to set up extensive financial support systems. So in that sense, it's not new. And the second remark about this is that the sanctions, of course, only work if Europe and the US cooperate. So Russia earns most of its gas and oil money in euros because it mostly most of the exports are to Europe and they earn euros for it. But a lot of their imports are settled in dollars. Their manufacturers' imports, right? So they have to find a place to, if they get the euros, to exchange them for dollars. And of course, you can go to European banks and do that. So unless European banks cooperate with blocking that, with saying no to Russian counterparts who want to exchange euros for dollars, or not to provide euros in the first place, right? One of these two options. Unless European banks do that, the Americans are powerless, really. If they're still providing dollars to Europe, but they're blocking out Russia, then the dollars will go through Europe to Russia, because Europe is one of the pivots of the global financial system. So those are two remarks on this question.
Thanks, Tony.
Yes, thank you. I think I have a question for Dirk. That's about financial sanctions. Also in the case of Belarus, we were discussing whether to cut out Belarus in some aspects. And then there was strong opposition from Austria just because of the interest which Raiffeisenbank had in Belarus. So it was very difficult for the Europeans to come to one common view. But what if the US would have unilaterally come up with such sanctions? I mean, of course, we don't like in Europe the extraterritorial effect of US sanctions, but I think it wouldn't have mattered what Europe then did or did not, because, well, Raiffeisenbank and Austria will simply cut its losses. So they also have their business in the US. So they may not like it, but they still have to somehow go along. So in such a case, does it really matter what Europe does or doesn't?
Dirk,
yes.
you want to respond directly? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think your reasoning is correct. If the US imposes sanctions such as on Iran, then basically every company in the world and every bank in the world needs to be careful what it does with Iran, and in this case with Belarus, unless they want to be cut out of the dollar payment network. So yeah, that's true, but of course it's maybe even more effective, and certainly it creates more space for future actions if you don't do it unilaterally, being the US, and if you don't force companies to do it, but if you go it together. So I think technically you're correct, but it would basically be the US forcing Europe to do something that Europe doesn't want to do if they didn't want to do it. So that why would you do that if you? So you're risking you're destroying some goodwill. So is Belarus really worth that? I think that's more the question. It's not a technical financial question.
Thanks. I see that Francisco has raised his hand.
Yes, thanks, Pim, and thanks for the very interesting presentations. I'm learning a lot. So I have one question, brief one. Well, the questions are brief. The answers I don't know. I'll let you decide. But I think that would be interesting also for me to know, but not only for the audience. So I have a question for Victor. Of course, we know, I mean, and thanks also, especially thanks to you, we know what the US and the EU have been doing recently. But what are the others doing? Do we know whether, and of course, there are the usual suspects that are joining, but can we have an overall understanding of what is the world doing in this situation? I have a question for Dirk, because of course, yes, thanks. It was super interesting. Again, this idea of raising the importance of the awareness of the denomination of currencies is super important. But I think that there is very little understanding of what would a world where not many people use the US dollar look like. Can you give us a sense of what are the costs and the problems? I mean, at the end, if 40% of trade is in US dollar, there must be some benefit that we lose if we don't do this anymore. And then for Helene, this confiscation is super interesting as well. And first of all, I know I've read that the UK and the US are doing something already in that direction for the change in the law for that. But I wanted to know what you can tell of what you're telling whoever asked you about the confiscation. What should we do and how? Because again, from my perspective, I see this as a very, very delicate issue. Now there is a little bit of global and collective hysteria about Russia, but going after private individuals' properties and confiscating them like that, it's a very slippery slope that I don't know whether it's worth going. But I'll let you tell me what you think about this. Thank you, and sorry for the long question.
So these are 3 questions, right, for Victor, Dirk, and Helene. May I suggest that we go to Helene first, in view of the time, and then Dirk, or then Victor, and then Dirk.
Okay, Francesco, thank you very much for your interesting question. I already hope that somebody will ask this question, so you did it. Yes, this is really a difficult issue, and other countries may already amend their legislation, but still it is a very delicate question. And also what I discussed in the parliament, it is we have just to find something. That's what they think also, something that oligarchs will now be criminals. So maybe they has to become member of a criminal organization, that Putin is the leader of that criminal organization. That's very strange, but maybe that's a solution. And then I suggested that before we had also our Hells Angels, who had just a motorcycle, and they were no criminals, and just then they became too difficult for our society, and then the legislator decided that when you are a member of Hells Angel, then you are a member of criminal organizations. So then that's the first step, because we have to do something that they will be held liable for a criminal offense. But just being an oligarch, it's not a criminal offense. So we have still to tackle this issue, but then there will be the next problem that always the council confirmed or said that the sanction regulations and decisions, they are just administrative, temporary and reversible measures. And also the Court of Justice is always confirming that there is no infringement on on your property, because it's only that temporary measure. So if we will change our legislation in that freezing can become confiscation, I think we will have also a huge problem with our procedures in front of the Court of Justice. And I'm very, looking forward to also their opinion, because if we are going to change something, we definitely need to know what Luxembourg will say about it. But currently, I have not the real solution. And also, if US and UK have already some possibilities, that does not say exactly that we in the EU will have the same possibilities, because they have other legislation, and also they have not a Court of Justice who always is confirming that it are administrative, reversible, and temporary measures. So that's the answer.
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting. An interesting development.
Yes, very interesting. I'm very much looking forward how we will solve this issue. Yeah.
Thanks. May I ask Victor and Dirk for a brief comment before we go to the last question by Ramses?
Yes.
Shall I go first?
So very briefly, yeah. Shall I go, Dirk, or shall? Okay. So once again, thank you, Francesco, for the question. So very briefly, what happens outside of the European Union and the United States? So within Europe, basically the common practice is that the European Union, or basically the high representative of the European Union, invites third countries with no EU membership to join its pre-cooked sanctions regime. So once the European Union decides on a particular sanctions regime, then it invites candidate states, but also EFTA states, potential candidate states, and by the way, also Eastern Partnership states to join the European Union sanctions regime. Now, there is a varying extent to which those states join European Union sanctions regime. So in general, we can say that candidate states usually implement those sanctions regimes because they are required to implement European Union law, including CFSP decisions and sanctions. Of course, there are some exceptions. Look at Serbia, the case of Serbia. Serbia is clearly reluctant to implement sanctions. But also EFTA states usually implement European Union sanctions given the shared values and shared objectives with the European Union. The only exception is Switzerland. Switzerland doesn't receive invitations, given that Switzerland likes to emphasize its neutral status. But if you look at the current case, you could see that Switzerland implemented most of the European Union sanctions with regard to sanctions. And Francesco, as you also said before our discussions, there is an interesting development in sanctions policy, given that the Faroe Islands also implemented European Union sanctions, which is, I mean, I've never heard about sanctions from them, but seemingly that's a novelty. But usually, so the short answer is that the European Union invites third countries to join its sanctions regime.
Dirk, a brief comment?
Yeah, so to Francesco's question, what does a post-dollar world look like? This is far too big a question, of course, to deal with properly here. Let me just say that we are far from this. Well, let me first answer the question and say, well, it would mean that most of our many countries' foreign reserves would plummet in value if the dollar suddenly loses much of its value, because most of its value is there because it's the world's money. It can be used everywhere. So that's why most countries are very reluctant to do that, even China. And second, it would mean that we give a lot of power to another country. And which country would that be? Because nobody knows the answer to that. Nobody can really envisage post-dollar world at the moment, although there's a lot of talk about it. Just as a measure for how far away we are from this, you can look at the amount of foreign reserves globally that are held in US dollars. And this is in thousands of billions of dollars, right? This is 7.1 for the US. The next one is 2.5 for the euro. So there are 3 times more dollars in foreign reserves globally than euros. And then the yen 0.6 and renminbi 0.3. Right, so there's a lot of talk, of course, about the renminbi being the next global currency. This is complete nonsense. There is 25 times more dollars, not a few times more, but 25 times more dollars, 7.1 compared to 0.3, than Chinese currency in foreign reserve. So probably for the next few years, to be sure, and maybe in our lifetime, we are looking at the dollar-denominated world, which is, to be fair, already a mixed world, right? A lot of payments are settled in euros, especially.
Thanks for that clear message, Dirk. I saw that Ramses had raised his hand. The thing is that we are halfway through this seminar, and Ramses is the next speaker of the second round. So I propose that he can take his turn then, and I will announce the second round of speakers of this seminar first. So let's go over to that second round. First, Ramses Wessel, Professor of European Law and Vice Dean of the Faculty of Law of the University of Groningen, is our first speaker for that panel. And then after that, we will have Dr. Tristan Cole, who's Associate Professor of Macroeconomics, International and Monetary Economics at the Faculty of Economics and Business at the University of Groningen. And last but not least, Francesco Giumelli, Associate Professor in International Relations and International Organization at the Faculty of Arts of the University of Groningen and co-coordinator of the Illicit Trade Group. Without further ado, I would give the floor to Ramses. Ramses, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Pim. I will use my 5 minutes to briefly share with you a few of the things that are being discussed among lawyers, and especially the scholars in European law, in European Union law, in relation to sanctions. So this is not per se related to the Russian sanctions. These are general sanctions discussions that we had already for many years, and of course they came up again in that sense. And the focus of my 5 minutes speech will be on the judicial protection of those that are on the sanctions lists. So basically, the interesting thing about sanctions, looking from the perspective of European law, is that they obviously fall under the common foreign and security policy of the European Union, but also are very much related to economic policy. So they're an excellent example of something that falls in between and both covers foreign policy and economic policy. And in CFSP, in common foreign and security policy, it's interesting that most of the foreign policy actually is being used for sanctions. We did a study last year, and that came to about 70% of all the decisions taken in common foreign and security policy are somehow related to taking sanctions. Another interesting thing about the current sanctions actually is that already, again, since 2014, they're sort of autonomous sanctions. They're not like many of the sanctions we knew before on, for instance, terrorism, where people that were alleged terrorists were put on a list, famous Qadi cases, etc. Unlike those sanctions, these sanctions are not following Security Council, UN Security Council sanctions. Obviously, right? No decisions on these things can be taken by the UN Security Council, where Russia also has a seat, and even more than a seat, it has a veto. So these are things that the European Union is doing by itself. So it can also not blame anyone else for these type of sanctions in many of these cases. So in that sense, also, what comes up in legal scholarship is the question of legal protection. Because in many cases, sometimes there's indeed the Russian central banks or there's other entities, but in other cases, it's really individuals that are targeted by these sanctions. And as Helene already said, they're formally called administrative measures, right? It's not a criminal sanction. This is not a criminal procedure. These are administrative measures. But the results, obviously, are very much similar to when you are witnessing any criminal measures. So your assets may be frozen. You may not be able to travel. So they're very much punitive in a sense, in that sense. And that, of course, raises all kinds of questions on judicial protection and fair trial that in EU law have been discussed over the last, let's say, 15 years or so, even longer. So many of those listed persons, many of the persons that have been put on the list, even since 2014, have been challenging their listing before the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. Many of the Russians have indeed started procedures. If you look at those results, many of them actually won those cases, especially in the early days. The court actually said, well, you may be listed for the right reasons, but actually we do not really know because the motivation is very poor. So especially in the early days, we saw many of them actually, especially in the first instance and before the general court, we saw them simply winning a case. Over time, and especially recently, the council, when they were listing certain individuals, have become more secure about providing the reasons for their listing. But still, if you look at the list, it's just sometimes one or two sentences rather than giving full evidence of their involvement in these situations. So sanctions, in essence, are adopted indeed by the European Union and are adopted by the Council in this sort of famous two-step procedure. First, you take the policy decision, the political decision, and the funny thing is that one is still taken by a unanimous vote, or at least by unanimity. There's not really voting going on, but everyone has to agree with that political decision to target certain individuals, and then almost at the same time, sometimes even really at the same time during the same meeting, the regulation is adopted on the basis of which the measures actually are taking place. And those measures can, if you look at the Treaty on European Union, those measures can be taken against entities and indeed can be taken, as the treaty tells us, against natural or legal persons or groups or non-state entities. And the court has been given the power to say something about sanctions. And that is interesting because on any other political policy question, the court has nothing to say. So that has been ruled out. And the treaty legislator in the beginning, when they were drafting the treaty, they made an exception for exactly this situation. So nothing in foreign policy, but yes, on sanctions, in sanction situation, the court can actually say something and does have a jurisdiction. Final remark within my hopefully still 5 minutes is that the problem these days is still the sort of motivation, the stating of reasons for those listings. And the feeling is, and also if you look at the debates these days, and especially people like Helene have been working on that for quite some years. If you look at what is going on, something really needs to change in terms of making absolutely clear what the reasons were for certain people to appear on those lists and provide them with the correct judicial protection that any rule of law system should provide. Thank you very much, Ben.
Thank you very much, Ramses, for that judicial angle in this debate. Let's go over to Tristan. Tristan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ben, and thanks everyone for putting together this very interesting event. I'm also learning a lot, like Francesco already mentioned. So I'm looking at sanctions from the perspective of a trade economist. That's what I am by training. And when we as trade economists study sanctions, we like to think of all the economic consequences of sanctions. So in my line of research, I look at what kind of sanctions are imposed and what their consequences are, especially on trade flows. And surprisingly, there's still a lot that we don't know. Well, that's good news for us as researchers, of course. But let me tell you a little bit more about what we do know about when sanctions can be effective through the lens of 5 questions. And I like to use the analogy of a wall. So imagine that Europe and the US have put up a wall against Russia, right? And so what the aim of this, and then you want to trade. And so suddenly you see this wall. And then the first question is, when you hit a wall, is why is it here? And so that's one of the fundamental questions with any kind of sanction. That's to determine what is exactly its precise objective. Because if you want to speak about the effectiveness of a sanction, you need to know what the goal is. Is the goal to destabilize the regime? Is the goal to lead to some kind of negotiated outcome, force Russia into a negotiated peace? Is it to weaken the military? Is it to just inflict economic damage to make the Russian economy shudder or throw it back to Soviet-era times? What exactly is the goal? Because only once you know that goal can one analyze more effectively whether or not that goal is actually reached by implementing the sanction. For a lot of research that we have in terms of thinking about whether trade sanctions are effective, we looked at especially trade sanctions. So think about embargoes, right? Cutting off certain sectors from being allowed to export their goods to the targeted countries or barring imports from certain countries. And over the past 2 decades, these trade sanctions have become less predominant. And there's been more of a tendency to impose other types of sanctions, thinking about financial sanctions, targeting individuals, imposing travel bans, freezing their assets, etc. But when we think about these trade bans, you might imagine that these are always incredibly effective. But that brings me to the second point, and that is who actually built this wall. So in the case of who builds the wall, who imposes the sanction, it's incredibly important whether this is done unilaterally or whether this is done in a coordinated fashion. What we know from research is that if the US imposes sanctions, they tend to be effective. For one, of course, because of the size of the US market, but also because of this, the fact that the US imposes their sanctions by means of an extraterritorial strategy, right? So if you're caught violating a US sanction, even if it is not on the US territory, you're in trouble. What we know in general, however, is that only multilateral coordinated sanctions tend to be more effective than unilateral measures. So that might give you some hope as to thinking that the Russian or the sanction package that has now been adopted by several countries on Russian trade, that this could be effective in the long run. However, we also have to think about who this wall is built against. So you have to think not only about the country that you're targeting, but also the allied nations of these targets. So Belarus is also, of course, targeted. But one also needs to be mindful of the fact that sanctions can easily be undermined because, your wall is just over your area of territory, but you can easily just walk around that wall. And especially when it comes to international trade and to some extent capital, depending on whether or not you freeze foreign reserves, etc., that these goods and capital can just go elsewhere to other markets where there are no sanctions in place. So who is being sanctioned is an important question. Also, what we know from research is that democracies that are targeted tend to respond better to sanctions. That is, they tend to reverse their policy decisions to, so meaning that the sanction can be effective. But if it's an authoritarian regime, and also when there's a military conflict at stake, these sanctions are not going to be very helpful in changing that kind of behavior by the target. One might also think about the question, I see I'm already at 5 minutes, but other questions that I'd like to put on the table is exactly, when was this wall built? So here we can think about anticipated sanctions. So when you keep on announcing that you'll impose a sanction, there's a lot of adjustment time. And certainly given the experience that we've all had with COVID, with supply chains becoming really unreliable, unstable, it's business as usual that if a shock hits your economy, that you look for alternatives. And that's also what happens with sanctions. If you keep on threatening to impose them, that gives the targets a lot of time to adjust their strategies, rather than when you just slam on sanctions unannounced and incredibly forcefully, that could impose a much stronger shock. And another question at the end is, of course, how long is this wall going to be here, and what can we do to get around it? And that comes to the question of enforceability. Helene talked about that. And also the question of what can be done by allied nations of the targets to bypass these sanctions to help the targets get by, or simply reallocate their resources and divert them in different ways. So these are some of the thoughts. So there's a wall there, but unless it's a wall that fully encompasses all economic exchange between the target and sender, and actually the entire world economy, the research so far suggests that sanctions, yes, will have short-term effects, disruptive effects, but they do not tend to force countries on their knees, on their economic knees, so to speak, unless there are more concerted efforts involved. Thanks.
Thanks, Tristan, particularly for your metaphor of the wall, which reminded me, of course, of Pink Floyd and made me question, is there a blue sky above our heads or not? Let's go over to our last panelist of this second round. Francisco, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pim, and having you citing the Pink Floyd is really making me proud of co-coordinating the illicit trade group with you. Thanks for that. But also thanks to the speakers. I mean, again, we've been hearing about sanctions a lot. That's also why we wanted to have this event so badly. because this kind of concentration of expertise on sanctions is really, really rare. So I really thank you, all of you, again, for giving me the job of trying to, because as of now, at least I may be starting to talk about this a little bit, but talking also about the other side. At the end, sanctions is one of these, is a foreign policy instrument. So we talked about a lot about what it is and how it works, but is it working in this case? And in this case, this when the things get complicated. Of course, I'll try to put a few thoughts out there, and then I'm really happy to discuss anything with you. So the first question, or Tristan brought is into the picture, is what it is that we want to achieve. Now, the situation is clear. There is a country that invaded another one, of course, claiming at least raising at least two issues. One, the protection of Russian citizens or Russian speakers in Ukraine, and the other being threatened by security for its security from another alliance, especially NATO. So, of course, I wanted to give you this overview just to say that there is an accusation, but there is also a concern. So the long story short is that there is another side on the other side, and that's why sanctions, that's how sanctions can also be made sense of. Sanctions is also a negotiating tool. So a way to talk to someone else to create certain conditions according to which then you can have a discussion. So why do I say this? Because very often sanctions effectiveness is deemed as if Russia invades, then sanctions didn't work. If Russia doesn't go home tomorrow morning, then sanctions didn't work. It's way more complicated than that. I've been thinking and doing in my work of three different categories of how we can make sense of when sanctions when sanctions are useful in foreign policy. So the first concept will be the sanctions are trying to change the behavior of Russia. How do we do this? Of course, thinking about what it is that you want them to do. Do you want them to sit at the negotiating table? Do you want them to do something specifically according to which then you would lift the sanctions? And that is why, a side note also for the general debate, that's also why I also wrote already that thinking about stopping and becoming energy independent from Russia is not a sanction anymore, it's something else, because that is not going to be reversible. Once you stop buying oil because you build solar panels everywhere in the European Union, you don't need oil anymore, and therefore what can you have to negotiate a return to the table of Russia? So that is something that we're losing control of the beast, so we should be more careful and also being strategic about what it is that we want to achieve. So one could be indeed having Russia coming back to the table, and that would be more the coercive understanding. So making them do something that you wouldn't, that they wouldn't do otherwise. Then there is another logic, that's the constraining logic. The constraining logic is not really having them come to the table, but making sure that they cannot achieve what they would like to achieve. For instance, by creating an economic damage or by undermining the military capabilities to the point in which even if they want to take over Ukraine, Estonia, Finland, they cannot. So it's not about changing the will of Russia, but sanctions can change the capabilities of Russia. And this is also an objective, that even if Russia keeps doing what they do, what it does in the Donbass, in Georgia and elsewhere, still this is the red line that they cannot go beyond. This is also a different way of thinking and making sense of why are we having this set of sanctions. And then the last but not least is the signaling effect. Very often you read in the literature, but also unfortunately in the public debate, that these sanctions are only symbolic. Well, in foreign policy, symbols are very, very important. So just using the term symbolic just to disqualify or think that some foreign policy measure is not relevant is a fundamental mistake. You send signals to a number of audiences. You can send signals to the targets, to the people that you're negotiating with, just to promise that maybe later there will be a further sanction. You send signals to the audience in the targeted country. You send signals to your own audiences in your own constituencies. You can send signals also to others, to the watchers, the third parties, other people in other countries watching. And again, we already talked about, especially in the first session, talking about China. We haven't said India. South Africa, Brazil, what are these countries and these people doing is as important as the Faroe Islands in determining and understanding what happens when it comes to Russia sanctions. And then in terms of making sense of what, whether this is worth, and then I will close with these 2 points, I would also encourage all of you to think about, first, the costs. As of now, we're thinking a lot about the cost that European and Western and world economies are suffering because of the sanctions or because of the war. I really find it difficult now to distinguish the impact of the war and the impact of the sanctions on our economies. But at the same time, of course, if you want to make sense of any gains, anything that you buy, the first thing that you check is how much did you pay for it. So I would encourage everyone to think about, okay, what it is that we're achieving now with these sanctions set up, how much do we pay for it, and whether we want to increase the cost we will pay, whether what we gain would be equal or maybe marginally way less or way more than what we invest. So thinking about the cost, please, is very important to think whether sanctions is worth being imposed. And finally, think about the alternatives. Because if the alternative is, doing nothing, we all agree it's not an alternative. But at the same time, going to, escalating the war is maybe also a very risky course of actions. And with these two caveats, maybe what sanctions are doing, and of course an improved version of the sanctions, maybe sanctions in the story of Russia and in the story of this crisis are coming up to be more effective than people in doing what we are achieving, which means creating an incentive for Russia to come back to the table, undermining the military capabilities, and reassuring the international community that there is something as a golden principle that we all should follow. Then there are very few alternatives that are as cheap as sanctions at the moment. So that will be my 5 minutes, which turned to be a 7-minute statement. So thank you, Pim, for the tolerance.
Oh, you're welcome. Thanks, Francesco, for shedding light on this political dimension and international relations dimension of sanctions. Let's go to a second round of debate. One technical comment before we start. You can raise your hand, but it's not automatically lowered. So if you want to lower your hand after you feel that it's not longer relevant, please do so. So let's go to a second round. Panel members, please respond to each other. You're free to do so, and everyone in the public is definitely free to raise your hand. I see that Kyriaki wants to ask a question. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, again, thank you very much for the very interesting presentations. I have 2 questions, one for Tristan and another one for Francesco. Tristan, if I am correct, from your presentation, I understood that you're saying that it is best if a country right away fights the target instead of giving time for them to prepare. So, to my understanding, it is important that there is no threat period that there is in between. But I wonder to what extent this is aligned to the very well-known saying that the best victory is the one that you get without a battle, the one that requires no battle. Because based on that, one would expect that being able to threaten the target should be sufficient in itself. I would be curious what you think about it. And for Francesco, I very much agree that the message that you sent via the sanctions is very important. I am curious what you think about the case that the sanctions do not work after all. So what is the signal then that you give, the message that the sender gives to the recipient, and how detrimental it can be? Because yes, we sanction a country to reaffirm our values, to show our democratic status and promotion of democracy, but if the target does not change their behavior, this can also backfire and send different messages. So I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Kyriaki, for this great question. So, to clarify, in the context of the research that we've done about threatening to impose a sanction and actually just imposing a sanction, so what we've seen in various studies is that if you put on the goggles of what happens to trade flows, right? So what happens with my imports and exports if I threaten to impose a sanction? There's no real effect there, right? Yes, there's more economic uncertainty because, maybe the target is going to do something with us. Maybe the target is not going to do this. Maybe the sender is bluffing. Maybe the sender is serious, right? So you are sending off signals, just as Francesco explained, a very important thing to do in foreign policy. But as far as market responses are concerned, thinking about trade and what I also know about foreign direct investment, there's some, sure, but we're not going to respond to that. It's only once you actually impose these sanctions that there's actually any bite attached to it at all. So should we all live in a world in which there are no threats and we just immediately go into a battle? Well, we can't conclude that yet, because, as Francesco also mentioned, there is a signaling effect, not only to countries that are on the verge of doing something that the sender doesn't want it to do, but it's also a signal to many other audiences, and these signals may be sufficiently credible to deter them from actually taking an additional step, right? So that does raise the question of how credible are the threats that you make, right? So if you have a track record of I'll say it once, and if you test me again, it's just like with kids, if you're consistent in implementing that with which you threaten, right, then it's a credible threat. But if you keep on imposing or calling out these threats, but is it maybe 2 times that you have to threaten? Maybe it's 15 times before you actually do something. Maybe you don't do anything at all. Then any threat loses all its credibility. And that is something that one might argue the EU has been struggling with. If you look at the sanctions that it threatened to impose and eventually imposed in 2014, and how the effectiveness of those sanctions has been really debatable. So that is a question of how predictable and how credible are these signals that you're sending. So. On to Francesco, because his question, his response is going to piggyback very nicely on this, I expect.
Thanks. I also thanks Kiraki for the question. I also want to add one thing to the question for Tristan, because I think it's also important for us to start thinking in terms of signals that we have different type of targets. So if you want to send so for instance, I think that I'm now reading Tristan's mind, I think. But if you announce a set of sanctions to me, and then you say, in a week, I will come after your bank accounts, well, unless I lived through my life, I would move the money away. And I don't even need a week, I need way less. While if I am Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya, just to name 3 countries that had this issue, then it's way more difficult to hide the money or to hide the resources, because you are a state. So it's Libya tried, because there was a lot of overlap between Gaddafi's families and Libya's state in terms of ownership structure. But then for Russia, it's a bit different. So that's indeed also something I would like to add. And when it comes to the signal being ineffective, yes, it is indeed the case. I even build on your question, because what you can also do negatively is to, let's say that there is a very big crisis. And then it's clearly not in the interest of certain states to intervene, but they need to show something and then impose very light sanctions. So that light sanctions does not show commitment, but it shows that, lack of commitment. So, and then only in itself, there is a reputational damage. And we have seen this. You can explain this in many ways, but for instance, in the past, other cases in which you've seen very light sanctions, there's even a book called Doing Good or Feeling Good about Sanctions, because the idea was you do something so you can't be criticized for not having done anything. And that goes back to the question before. also building on your question, trying to answer it, of course, not doing anything is also a foreign policy decision. And that also carries a reputational risk, in the sense that you can indeed impose sanctions. Sanctions don't work. So the issue of sanctions in itself, or the tool, might suffer a reputational damage, or you as well. But also doing nothing carries a risk of having, well, you haven't done anything on human rights in a number of countries. I would list them, of course, but we know some of them. And then there is a question, why haven't you done anything? So that's something I would say about the signaling effect. And that last final point, and of course it also goes beyond this debate today, but sanctions are never imposed in isolation. So very often, if sanctions do not solve a political crisis, it is the sanctions' fault. Well, but why not the diplomatic initiatives, or the mediation, or the foreign policy, or the military tools? I mean, at the end, if you don't win a war, it's ultimately also the lack of capabilities of the military instrument. But the military instrument is always attached to a negotiation. If the mediation is not effective, I resort more on weapons, but not because I would like the weapons, because the mediation is poorly done. So maybe the mediation is to be blamed, not the military instrument. And it goes the same with sanctions. So we need to be careful in identifying. That's why we talk about the utility of a foreign policy instrument, not necessarily the effectiveness, because they're never imposed by themselves. There is always something else going on.
Thanks, Tristan and Francesco, for these comments. I've another question in the waiting room by Helene. So please, Helene, you have questions for Ramses and Francesco. The floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Pim, for giving me the floor. Yes, a small question to Ramses, because it was a very interesting presentation, of course. And you mentioned that in the beginning a lot of Russians were successful with their procedures at the Court of Justice in Luxembourg, because they won their cases. But based upon my opinion, it was just a Pyrrhus overwinning, because the sanctions have been prolonged more or less every year. So I don't think this is a winning situation. Maybe you can explain this a little bit more detailed.
Yes, that is absolutely right. What you see happening, and I should have mentioned that. What you see happening is, of course, whenever somebody succeeds in court, and then the court says, yes, you're absolutely right, you should be delisted because of a lack of motivation. Yeah. Then almost immediately the council tries to come up with a repair type of decision, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. So they say, okay, then we sort of adapt the motivation. We try we simply list you again, or in many cases the people are not even delisted. They never really disappear from the list. The legal basis for their listing just changes. So it is absolutely a good point, and that makes it very difficult, and sort of strengthens also my point that it is in a way it's a bit of an unfair system, right? Where you exactly. Of course we would agree that it's there's nothing else you can do at the moment, but from a legal procedural point of view, it's not a very fair system. I mean, Pim being a criminal lawyer, or at least a lawyer active in criminal law, would more know about that and about the balance of those things. Yes, there is a need to do this, but we need to make sure that the protection is in order.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. I hope it will be changed in the near future. And you are an influential person. Maybe we can have discussions about it.
But the problem, Helene, I think, is that it's not that easy to change, because in many situations you do not have too much evidence. Somebody is affiliated to that government. Yeah. Somebody is related to that and that. And so sometimes the intelligence offices and services do not really provide much more information than that. So I'm not sure how to solve that.
I agree with that. So maybe we can continue this discussion afterwards. Thank you. Sure. And I have a small question also to Francesco, because last month I was very often in the media, or last 2 months, and always they ask me why we are imposing sanctions, because there's no real success, no direct success in Russia. Of course, you mentioned it, that sanctions will not have the effect that tomorrow Putin will say, okay, I stop the war because the sanctions are too serious. But can you explain, or have you one success story? Because you studied a lot of different sanction regimes for different countries, so maybe there's one small success once. Okay.
Well, of course, indeed, there are more than one. Again, the media reports and the way in which sometimes we talk about sanctions is a problem for the utility and the understanding of the tool. Indeed, I do agree with Kyriaki that the best sanctions are the ones that you don't need to impose. So there are a lot of sanctions that have been only suggested, and things get fixed right away. But even without talking, I mean, and that's the signaling effect, right? That's the indirect signaling effect. Now we impose a set of sanctions on a number of individuals in Russia. Don't you think that this is an effect on other regimes where other individuals are connected with the regimes and they have a lot of money, possibly in the European Union and in the United States? So the behavior of those individuals is already affected by this set of sanctions. So that's how we need to understand sanctions. It's about creating the expectations about what the future will look like if similar events will happen. And that is not something that you see. And then, now I'm talking about the case in Russia in itself. Then the other thing I want to say about the specific case of Russia, and then I will give you a couple of examples, is that there was a lot of unclarity, and Victor said this correctly. Very few people would have expected this kind of sanctions, because this kind of unity from the EU especially was not foreseeable. And I think that also people in the Kremlin did not expect this type of unity as well. So it's very difficult to say, well, sanctions didn't deter Putin from invading. Putin never thought about these sanctions in the first place. So you can't be deterred from things you don't know. And that is part of the story, that sanctions, as many other foreign policy instruments, are dialectic. It's not, it rains, you use the umbrella and you don't get wet. These kind of connections never works in practice. Sanctions are dialectic, so you see the build-up over time. You see sanctions becoming stronger after the Bucha discoveries in Ukraine and the human rights violations in Ukraine, not before. Same thing in Crimea, and especially the Donbass in 2014, after the MH17. So you always need to think in dialectic terms, where there is a cost raised, responding to some problems. And then in general terms, in Angola, sanctions worked. In parts in Yugoslavia, sanctions worked. There are a number of cases in which, and that's something also, and then I will stop talking because I can talk for a long time on this specific issue, but the lifting of sanctions is as important as the imposition of sanctions. That's what sanctions become also very useful, because and that's why I was raising the issue before, is that if you become energy independent from Russia, this is not a sanction anymore, because it's something else. So you need to be able to go back to the status quo for sanctions to make sense, because that's when you start using them. Once you impose them, then you start lifting them. And then, of course, in terms of effectiveness, you need to think in counterfactuals. What would the world look like without sanctions? So when journalists ask you, what's wrong with these guys imposing sanctions, ask them back, what would Ukraine look like without sanctions? Then maybe they find a little bit of effectiveness themselves without asking you the question.
Okay, thank you very much, Francesco. I agree. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Thanks for this. In view of the time, I know that some people have to leave at 3:30, so we'll have to wrap up in a couple of minutes. But there can be definitely room for one or two last questions, perhaps two if they are very short. If anyone wants to intervene, I see that you have still raised your hand, Francesco, but I'm not sure that you would want to ask.
No, this is a question, so whenever you want, I can ask the question.
Oh, please go ahead. Yeah. So one brief last question.
Of course. Thanks. I mean, the question is for Ramses and anyone else, of course, especially the PIM and the lawyers in the room. There is a lot of, I see the tension, right? Because of course I come from the IR and foreign policy angle, how important are individual protections when there are these type of war situations and conflicts? How do we know where can we get and where should we stop? Should we stop at any point? How do we deal with this tension? And that would be great to have your thoughts on this. Thanks.
Ramses, do you want to answer that?
I can do that quickly. It's a big question, Francesco, but I'll try and give you a short answer. No, we should not stop. What we should do is make sure that once we do it according to the rules. I mean, it's not very convincing to target certain countries, for instance, because they're violating the rule of law, which sometimes happens, by actually also violating the rule of law. So in that balance, I would actually say yes, we should continue doing that, but it's really time now to make sure that we live up to the rules we also export to other countries.
Thanks. That's I can only stress that, of course, being a lawyer as well. That sounds very like a very decent line of reasoning to me. I think we'll have reached the end of this roundtable. Some final thoughts. I was triggered by a lot of things. I think it's wonderful that we had such a great exchange of ideas from many different disciplines. Law, economics, political theory, all coming to the table. I think that's really valuable that we meet each other in this way and that we have some exchange of thoughts. What I find interesting in the effectiveness approach, of course, is that we also have different concepts of effectiveness. That symbolic actions can be valued very differently in one discipline from another. And what I find interesting in that, coming from the criminal law field, we're used to theories of punishment that try to get all kinds of ideas and objectives behind punishment together in a box. And also that works like that in practice. When sitting as a judge after hearing a case, you have to decide on the punishment, and you maybe 3 judges that have very different points of view. But you have to come together, and you can even be on exactly the same page as to the nature and duration of the punishment, while having very different ideas and objectives behind that. One wants to deter, another one wants to just merely punish. Retribution can be important. Incapacitation can be very different. A reason to choose exactly the same outcome. That makes effectiveness very difficult to assess, because you don't share the objective, but you share the outcome. So that makes it very difficult to talk about effectiveness, but I think it's still important to have these very differing thoughts on the table and get them together like this. I really want to thank our panelists, Victor, Dirk, Helene, Ramses, Tristan and Francesco. Let's have a round of virtual applause. There is a button on the left side of your screen, I think, and it works like this. Thanks a lot to everyone. Thanks as well to the Agricola School for Sustainable Development for making this event possible and for moderating everything. Thank you very much. I hope we will see you again at other events of the Illicit Trade Group. Thanks for now. We have to end here. And thanks all for the participation of anyone involved here. Thanks a lot and have a good day.
Yeah, thank you.